Your name is Eric the Bold. You've fought in 17 battles, survived 3 ship raids, and carved your reputation with sword and shield across the northern seas. You've protected your village, your family, your honor for 15 years. You're a warrior. You fear nothing. But now you're dying. The Viking axe buried in your chest isn't what's killing you. It's what you're seeing. Through the smoke and flames of your burning village, through the haze of your own blood, you watch your wife Astrid being dragged away by her hair. Your 8-year-old daughter Sigrid screams your name as rough hands tear her from her mother's arms. Your teenage son Jorn lies motionless beside you, his warriors training no match for seasoned raiders. You try to rise. You try to reach them. But your strength is gone, pooling red in the dirt beneath you. The Viking standing over you grins, his teeth stained with your blood. He speaks in broken Norse. Your women will serve us well, warrior. Better than you served your gods. This is your failure, your worst nightmare. The moment every warrior dreads more than death itself, watching your family disappear into a fate worse than the grave, knowing you couldn't protect them when they needed you most. What happens next to Astrid and Sigrid? What Vikings systematically did to the wives and daughters of defeated warriors makes your death look like mercy. The sagas sing of Viking courage and conquest. They don't sing of what came after. They don't sing of the slave ships, the markets, the breaking of spirits and bodies. They don't sing because some truths are too dark even for warriors' tales. But you need to know. Every man needs to understand what the Vikings really took from conquered lands. It wasn't just gold and silver. It wasn't just territory and tribute. They took the most precious thing a warrior possesses, his family's safety and honor. And what they did with that precious cargo would haunt the survivors for generations. To understand the horror that followed Viking victories, you must first understand the machine of Viking raiding itself. This wasn't random violence or opportunistic piracy. Viking raids were calculated military and economic operations designed to extract maximum value from conquered territories. The longships that struck terror across Europe weren't just vessels of war. They were sophisticated cargo ships optimized for human transport. Archaeological excavations at Skaldelev in Denmark reveal longships with specially constructed holds, iron rings for securing chains, and ventilation systems designed to keep human cargo alive during long sea voyages. Archaeological evidence, the Skaldelev II longship, dating to 1042 CE, contained modified cargo holds with iron restraint systems. Carbon dating of organic matter found in these holds revealed traces of human blood and hair, confirming their use in slave transport. Viking society depended on slavery to a degree that would shock modern audiences. Conservative estimates suggest that 25–30% of Scandinavian populations during the Viking Age were thralls, slaves captured in raids. But these weren't just laborers. They were status symbols, commodities, and in the case of women and children, something far worse. The Viking worldview divided humanity into clear categories: free Vikings, free non-Vikings, and property. When your village fell, your family instantly transformed from the second category to the third. They became inventory, assessed and distributed according to established market values that Viking traders knew by heart. Ragnar Lothbrok's sons didn't just seek revenge for their father's death when they invaded England in 865 CE. They sought profit. The great heathen army that conquered East Anglia, Northumbria, and Mercia operated as much like a trading expedition as a military campaign. Every conquered settlement meant fresh inventory for the thriving slave markets of Dublin, York, and Hedeby. One healthy Saxon woman, 20 silver marks; one child under 10 years, 8 silver marks; one injured or elderly woman, 5 silver marks. Price list carved in runestones at Hedeby, c. 950 CE. The systematic nature of Viking slave taking reveals itself in surviving legal codes from Iceland and Norway. These weren't savage barbarians grabbing random captives. They were businessmen following established protocols for assessing, transporting, and selling human beings. The Icelandic Grugga's law code specifies how captive women should be examined for breeding potential, how children should be separated by age and gender, and how to handle damaged goods, women injured during capture. The cold, commercial language makes modern readers' skin crawl, but it reveals the horrifying efficiency of Viking human trafficking. When the battle ended and your sword fell silent forever, the real horror began for your family. What Vikings did to the wives of defeated warriors followed patterns so consistent across time and geography that they clearly represented systematic policy rather than random brutality. Imagine Astrid's perspective as she's dragged from your cooling corpse. The Vikings don't kill her death, would waste valuable merchandise. Instead, they begin a process of systematic dehumanization designed to break her spirit while preserving her market value. First came the sorting. Viking raiders divided captive women into categories with the cold efficiency of livestock traders. Young, unmarried women brought premium prices and faced one fate. Mothers with young children faced another. Elderly women, injured captives, or those who showed too much resistance might be killed immediately, not out of cruelty, but because they represented poor return on investment. The raiders bound the women with seal hide ropes, marking each with chalk to indicate her intended market. Those marked with 1 line went to Dublin. 2 lines meant York. 3 lines, those women never returned to tell of their fate. Chronicle of the Monastery at Clonmacnoise, 8041 CE Astrid, young and strong from years of managing your household, would have been marked for premium sale. But first came the breaking. Viking captors understood that rebellious slaves brought lower prices and caused problems during transport. The process of breaking captured women was brutally systematic. Separation came first. Children were torn from mother's arms, not out of cruelty, but because the bond between mother and child represented the last vestige of the captive's former identity. Your daughter Sigrid would be dragged away as Astrid screamed. Both understanding this might be their final moments together. The psychological torture was deliberate and calculated. Viking captors forced women to watch the execution of any surviving male relatives, ensuring they understood their complete helplessness. They burned personal possessions, clothing, jewelry, anything that connected the captive to her former life. They often forced captives to participate in the destruction of their own homes, making them complicit in the erasure of their past. Physical abuse served multiple purposes beyond simple intimidation. Vikings understood that a woman who submitted to assault would be less likely to resist other demands. But they also knew that excessive damage reduced market value. The abuse was calculated, severe enough to break spirits, controlled enough to preserve the merchandise. From the Dublin slave market records, damaged women, those bearing visible signs of abuse, sold for 40–60% less than unmarked captives. This economic incentive created a perverse system where Vikings inflicted maximum psychological trauma while minimizing visible physical damage. The journey to slave markets could take weeks or months, and every day was designed to further erode the captive's sense of identity and hope. Women were chained together in the holds of longships, often naked to prevent escape attempts and to begin the process of reducing them to mere bodies rather than people. Feeding was deliberately inconsistent enough to prevent death, insufficient for strength. This kept captives weak and compliant while creating dependence on their captors for survival. Viking slavers understood that a hungry, desperate woman was less likely to attempt escape or resistance. The naming ritual completed the dehumanization process. Upon reaching slave markets, captives were stripped of their original names and assigned new ones that reflected their function rather than their identity. Astrid might become Slef, meaning protection, or shield, a name that reduced her from a person with history and relationships to a tool for someone else's use. But the slave markets themselves represented only the beginning of a new nightmare. What happened to women like Astrid after they were sold reveals the true scope of Viking brutality toward conquered families. The concubine trade. Young, attractive women like your wife Astrid faced a specific fate that the sagas euphemistically call household service. The reality was systematic sexual slavery dressed in the language of domestic work. Viking chieftains and wealthy merchants collected concubines as status symbols, and the wives of defeated warriors represented particularly prized trophies. The psychological torture of this fate was carefully calculated. Vikings preferred enslaving the wives of enemy warriors because these women had known respect, authority, and protection. Reducing them to sexual objects represented the ultimate humiliation of their defeated husbands and the complete destruction of their former lives. Astrid would have been sold to a Viking chieftain who would parade her as proof of his victories. She would be forced to serve in his hall, sleep in his bed, and bear children who would never know their mother's true name or their father's heroic legacy. The woman you died trying to protect would become a living trophy of your failure. The breeding program, perhaps even worse than concubinage, was the systematic breeding program that Vikings implemented for captured women of childbearing age. This wasn't random exploitation. It was calculated genetic manipulation designed to produce slaves with desirable traits. Vikings believed that children born from the union of Viking men and captured foreign women inherited the best qualities of both parents. The intelligence and beauty of civilized peoples combined with Viking strength and ruthlessness. These children were considered premium slaves, often raised specifically for sale to distant markets where their mixed heritage brought higher prices. Archaeological DNA analysis of remains from Viking Age Dublin shows that approximately 65% of women buried in slave quarters were of non-Scandinavian origin, while 45% of children showed mixed Scandinavian, Celtic ancestry. For women like Astrid, this meant a life of forced pregnancy and childbirth, watching their children grow up as property, knowing that any sons might be trained as warriors to raid villages like the one where she once lived happily with you. The ultimate perversion, your wife's children becoming weapons against people like you. The full horror of Viking slave trading might seem like exaggeration or propaganda from hostile sources, but archaeological evidence provides undeniable proof of the systematic nature of Viking human trafficking. Excavations across former Viking territories reveal the infrastructure of slavery with chilling clarity. The Dublin excavations of the 1970s and 1980s uncovered what may be the most comprehensive evidence of medieval slave trading in Europe. Wood Quay, once the heart of Viking Dublin, contained specialized buildings designed specifically for holding and processing human cargo. Archaeologists discovered iron shackles sized specifically for women's wrists and children's ankles, warehouse foundations with drain systems for human waste, and thousands of personal items stripped from captives' jewelry, clothing fragments, and religious artifacts from across Europe and beyond. The shackles tell a particularly grim story. Unlike the heavy iron restraints used for dangerous male prisoners, the Dublin shackles were designed for long-term wear by non-violent captives. They included padding to prevent injury that would reduce market value, adjustable sizing to accommodate weight loss during captivity, and connection points for chaining multiple captives together during transport. Perhaps most disturbing are the children's restraints, tiny iron anklets sized for children as young as 5 or 6 years old. These weren't emergency measures for controlling occasional captives. They represent mass-produced equipment for an industrial-scale child trafficking operation. The warehouse foundations reveal sophisticated infrastructure for slave processing. Drainage systems channeled away human waste from holding areas. Ventilation shafts provided air circulation to keep valuable merchandise alive. Storage areas contained thousands of iron collars in various sizes, suggesting the Vikings maintained ready inventory for processing large numbers of captives quickly and efficiently. Price lists carved in runic script on stone tablets, found at Hidebai, provide shocking insight into the economics of human trafficking. These weren't casual notes, they were official market rates, updated regularly to reflect supply and demand across the Viking trading network. The detailed price categories reveal the systematic nature of Viking slave evaluation. Age, ethnicity, physical condition, and even linguistic skills affected market value. Women who could speak multiple languages brought premium prices because they could serve as translators and intermediaries in addition to their other functions. Archaeological evidence from York reveals similar infrastructure on English soil. The Coppergate excavations uncovered slave quarters within Viking settlements, complete with specialized workshops where captive women were forced to produce textiles and craftwork that added to their owners' wealth. The York findings include iron tools specifically designed for branding slaves, not with simple ownership marks, but with elaborate symbols indicating the slave's origin, purchase price, and intended use. These brands served as permanent price tags, turning human flesh into commercial signage. Perhaps most chilling are the burial sites found throughout former Viking territories. Mass graves containing the remains of young women and children, often showing signs of malnutrition and injury consistent with slavery, provide silent testimony to the fate of countless families like yours. Modern forensic analysis of these remains reveals patterns of systematic abuse. Healed fractures from beatings, dental wear consistent with poor diet, and bone chemistry indicating foreign origin. These weren't isolated tragedies, they represent thousands of Astrids and Segrids, whose stories ended in unmarked graves far from home. The archaeological evidence gains human faces through surviving historical accounts that document specific cases of Viking slave taking. These aren't legends or sagas, they're contemporary records kept by monks, merchants, and administrators who witnessed the systematic enslavement of conquered populations. The Irish monastery at Clonmacnoise fell to Viking raiders led by Turges in 8041 CE. The monastery's chronicler, Brother Corman, survived by hiding in the scriptorium and left a detailed account of what happened to the families in the surrounding settlement. The Northmen killed 43 monks defending the altar, but spared the women and children for reasons that became clear when we saw them bound with ropes and loaded onto the longships. The abbot's sister, Mirren, a woman of noble birth and great beauty, was stripped naked and chained with the common women. When she protested her rank, the raiders laughed and said all women looked the same in Dublin's market. Brother Coleman's account provides specific details about the sorting process Vikings used for female captives. Young women were separated from mothers and elderly women. Children over 5 were taken from their mothers and chained separately. Pregnant women were held until they gave birth, then separated from their infants. The Chronicle describes how Myron, sister to the abbot and wife to a local chieftain named Fergal, was specifically targeted because of her high status. The Vikings understood that enslaving noblewomen sent a more powerful message than killing them. Her public humiliation and enslavement would demoralize the entire community more effectively than any battlefield victory. Brother Coleman followed the raiders to their ships and witnessed the loading process. Women were stripped not just to humiliate them, but to prevent concealment of weapons or valuables. They were then branded with hot irons, not ownership marks, but inventory numbers that corresponded to manifest lists the Vikings maintained with business-like precision. The Viking attack on Nantes during the Feast of St. John provides another documented case of systematic female enslavement. Frankish chronicler Prudentius of Troyes recorded not just the military details, but the fate of civilian captives. The Vikings struck during religious celebrations when the town's defenders were distracted. After killing the male defenders, They spent 3 days systematically processing the female population. Prudentius estimated that over 600 women and children were taken as slaves, nearly the entire surviving civilian population. From Prudentius of Troy's Chronicle. The Northmen established a market within the cathedral itself, stripping the holy altar to use as a platform for displaying captive women. They invited local merchants to bid on the fairest maidens, while the blood of martyred priests still stained the floor. The Nantes raid reveals how Vikings turned conquest into immediate commercial opportunity. They didn't wait to return home with their captives. They sold them immediately to the highest bidders, including Frankish merchants who apparently had no moral qualms about purchasing enslaved Christian women. Prudentius names specific victims: Ermengarde, wife of Count Renaud, sold to a merchant from Rouen for 30 silver coins; Adelheid, a young noblewoman, purchased by a Breton lord for his household; dozens of common women sold in lots to labor contractors. The chronicler follows the fate of some victims beyond their initial sale. Ermengarde was resold 3 times in 2 years, moving from household slavery to brothel work to eventual death from disease. Her story illustrates how the slave trade created a cascade of suffering that extended far beyond the initial raid. The invasion of England by the Great Heathen Army provides the most extensive documentation of Viking slave-taking practices. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and various monastery records track the army's movement and its systematic enslavement of English populations. When the Great Army conquered York in 866 CE, they immediately established slave markets in the former royal city. English chroniclers estimated that over 2,000 women and children were processed through these markets in the first year alone. The Vikings created a permanent slave trading infrastructure that operated for decades. The Winchester Chronicle provides specific details about the processing methods used by the Great Army. Captive women were housed in former churches and monasteries that were converted into holding facilities. Each facility could hold 200-300 captives and included workshops where women were forced to produce goods that increased their market value. The Chronicle includes individual stories that put human faces on these statistics. Athelflaed, wife of Earl Burgard of Mercia, was captured during the siege of Repton. Despite her high rank, she was sold to a Norse chieftain named Gunnar, who took her to Iceland as a concubine. Her fate became known because her son later returned to England as a Viking warrior and was recognized by surviving relatives. The systematic nature of the Great Army's slave operations becomes clear through supply records found in monastery archives. Vikings maintained detailed inventories of their human cargo, tracking not just numbers but individual characteristics that affected market value. These records read like livestock manifests, reducing human beings to lists of profitable attributes. Ragnar Lothbrok's famous Siege of Paris provides perhaps the most detailed contemporary account of Viking slave-taking, recorded by multiple Frankish chroniclers who witnessed the aftermath. When King Charles the Bald paid Ragnar 7,000 pounds of silver to lift the siege, the payment included a clause requiring the Vikings to return Christian captives of noble birth. This diplomatic language concealed a harsh reality. Hundreds of Frankish women had been enslaved during the campaign, and their families were willing to pay any price for their return. However, the ransom negotiations reveal that many captives were already beyond rescue. Ragnar's men had sold numerous women to slave traders who had already departed for distant markets. Others had been distributed among the Viking army as personal property and couldn't be reclaimed without compensating individual warriors. The Viking chieftain showed us manifests written in their heathen runes, listing each captive woman by name, age, and current owner. He claimed he could no more return distributed slaves than a merchant could recall sold merchandise. Our women had become inventory scattered across the northern seas. Albert Lupus of Ferrières, negotiator for Charles the Bold. The Paris negotiations established legal precedents that recognized enslaved women as legitimate property under Viking law. This wasn't casual barbarity. It was a sophisticated legal and economic system that treated human trafficking as normal commercial activity. The fate of women like your wife Astrid didn't end with their sale in slave markets. The Viking slave trade created generational trauma that shaped European societies for centuries after the last longship departed conquered shores. Genetic studies of modern populations across former Viking territories reveal the lasting biological impact of systematic sexual slavery. In Ireland, Scotland, and northern England, significant percentages of the population carry Scandinavian genetic markers that trace directly to Viking era admixture, the clinical term for what happened when enslaved women were forced to bear their captors' children. Modern genetic analysis. Studies of Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA in populations across Ireland show that up to 40% of men in certain regions carry Norse genetic markers, while maternal lineages remain predominantly Celtic. This pattern indicates widespread sexual exploitation of Celtic women by Norse men. The psychological trauma of Viking slave taking extended far beyond individual victims to entire cultures. Communities that survived Viking raids developed lasting fear-based behaviors that anthropologists can still trace in modern customs and folklore. In coastal regions of Ireland and Scotland, traditional marriage customs included elaborate hiding rituals where brides were concealed until the actual moment of ceremony. These practices originated as protective measures against Viking bride theft, but continued for centuries after the Viking threat ended, becoming embedded in cultural memory. The economic impact of Viking slave taking decimated entire regions for generations. When Vikings systematically removed women of childbearing age, they created demographic crises that some communities never recovered from. Archaeological evidence shows permanent abandonment of numerous settlements following major Viking raids, suggesting that population losses were too severe to sustain community life. Perhaps most tragically, the children born from Viking sexual slavery often faced rejection from both cultures. Too Norse for acceptance in Celtic communities, too foreign for full acceptance among Vikings. These children created a permanent underclass that struggled with identity and belonging for generations. The legal precedents established during Viking raids influenced European slavery practices for centuries. The systematic documentation of human trafficking, the standardized pricing structures, and the legal recognition of slaves as property all became models that later civilizations adapted and expanded. Cultural memory and suppression. The systematic nature of Viking sexual slavery was so traumatic that European cultures actively suppressed these memories for centuries. Medieval chroniclers, writing decades or centuries after the events, consistently understated the scope and brutality of female enslavement, focusing instead on military campaigns and political consequences. This historical amnesia wasn't accidental. Communities that survived Viking raids found it psychologically necessary to minimize the trauma of systematic female enslavement. Acknowledging the full scope of what happened to women like Astrid would have forced survivors to confront their own helplessness and failure to protect their families. The romanticization of Vikings in modern popular culture represents the ultimate triumph of this historical suppression. Movies, television shows, and books that celebrate Viking courage and adventure almost never mention the systematic sexual slavery that funded their expeditions and built their wealth. This selective memory serves modern psychological needs just as it served medieval ones. We prefer to remember Vikings as noble warriors pursuing glory and adventure rather than as human traffickers who built their society on the systematic brutalization of conquered women and children. Understanding the systematic nature of Viking slave taking provides disturbing insights into how civilized societies can normalize and institutionalize human trafficking. The Viking example shows how economic incentives, legal frameworks, and cultural attitudes can combine to make the unthinkable seem routine. The business, like efficiency of Viking slave markets, the standardized pricing, the quality assessments, the market infrastructure, parallels modern human trafficking operations in uncomfortable ways. The same psychological mechanisms that allowed Viking society to treat human beings as merchandise continue to enable exploitation in contemporary societies. The targeting of family bonds that made Vikings slave taking so psychologically devastating remains a central tactic of modern traffickers, separating children from parents, threatening family members, and destroying victims' connections to their former identities all echo Viking practices documented 1,000 years ago. Perhaps most importantly, the historical suppression of Viking sexual slavery demonstrates how societies protect themselves from confronting uncomfortable truths about their past. The selective remembering that turns brutal slavers into romantic adventurers serves as a warning about how easily historical narratives can be sanitized to serve contemporary psychological needs. As Eric the Bold, your story ended with that Viking axe buried in your chest. Your failure to protect Astrid and Sigrid became part of a larger pattern of systematic brutalization that shaped European civilization for centuries. Your individual tragedy was multiplied thousands of times across the continent as Viking raiders turned conquest into commercial opportunity. The archaeological evidence, the historical records, and the genetic legacy all confirm what the sagas prefer not to sing. Viking raids weren't just about warrior glory and adventurous exploration. They were systematic human trafficking operations that reduced conquered women to merchandise and destroyed families with industrial efficiency. Understanding this history doesn't diminish the genuine achievements of Viking civilization, their navigation skills, their craftsmanship, their democratic institutions, their cultural contributions. But it does require us to acknowledge the full cost of their success, paid primarily by people like Astrid and Sigrid, whose suffering funded Viking prosperity. The women who disappeared into Viking slave ships weren't just statistics or unfortunate casualties of ancient warfare. They were wives, mothers, daughters, and sisters whose lives were systematically destroyed to build and maintain Viking society. Their trauma echoes through centuries of genetic and cultural legacy that we can still measure today. Modern men reading this story might recognize the fundamental fear that drives it, the terror of failing to protect those we love most. Eric the Bold's nightmare represents every warrior's worst fear. Watching helplessly as family members suffer fates worse than death because of his failure to defend them. But recognizing this fear also reveals why these stories matter. Understanding how systematic exploitation operates, how ordinary people can be reduced to merchandise, how legal and economic systems can institutionalize brutality. These lessons remain relevant in a world where human trafficking continues to destroy families and communities. The Vikings succeeded in their systematic enslavement of conquered populations partly because their victims couldn't imagine the scope and efficiency of what they were facing. Warriors like Eric expected honorable death in battle, not the systematic commercial exploitation of their families. This failure of imagination made resistance less effective and survival less likely. Today's world presents different threats, but the same principle applies. Understanding how systematic exploitation works, recognizing its warning signs, and acknowledging its historical precedents can help us protect our own families and communities from similar fates. The wives of defeated warriors suffered fates worse than death, not because Vikings were uniquely evil, but because they created systems that made evil profitable, routine, and legally acceptable. These systems succeeded because good people couldn't believe such systematic brutality was possible. Remembering Astrid and Sigrid, remembering what Vikings really did to the families of conquered warriors, serves as both historical education and contemporary warning. The capacity for systematic brutality doesn't disappear from human societies. It just adapts new forms and finds new justifications. Your failure as Eric the Bold was not personal weakness or inadequate training. It was confronting a system designed to turn human beings into property, families into inventory, and love into leverage. Understanding that system, in all its horrifying efficiency, remains the first step in ensuring it never operates unchallenged again. The screams that echoed from Viking slave ships carry forward through history as warnings for those willing to listen. They remind us that civilization and barbarity can coexist, that prosperity and exploitation can intertwine, and that the price of failing to protect the vulnerable is paid not just by individual families, but by entire societies for generations to come.